Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this episode of Dinner Guide. My name is Chef Andy, and today we are going to be doing something a little different. We are going to be doing some chicken on a skewer. I'll also be showing you how to make a very simple fried rice recipe. Now before we begin, I'll of course introduce you to the ingredients before us, just to give you an idea of what to expect for this show. So from the very front, you will require about half a cup of some pre-made, pre-chopped vegetables, being of course a variety of carrot, garden peas, and of course French beans. You'll also require a tablespoon of some turmeric powder, about a teaspoon of some coriander powder, and a bit of some 5-spice Chinese spice. You'll also require half a cup of some basmati rice, about 1 medium-sized onion and 1 large green pepper. You'll also require some bamboo skewer sticks. You also require some lemongrass and some spring onion, some salt and some black peppercorns for seasoning, a bit of oil to cook with, and of course last but not least about 400 grams of some boneless chicken, or of course some chicken breast. So we're going to allow you this chance to refresh and wind up for the show, and when we come back we'll just dive right into it. So see you in a little bit. Welcome back viewers. If you missed out on the introduction to the show today, we're basically going to be doing some chicken on some skewers, and I'll also be showing you how to make some very simple rice. Now to begin the process, of course, very important to always have your rice cooked beforehand. So we'll begin the process by heating our first pot, which to that we will add some water to aid us in cooking our rice. Now to that, very importantly, always season very lightly with some salt, and you can also add a small dash of oil, and this is basically to aid you in getting some beautiful fluffy rice. And now we're going to allow that just a few minutes to come to the boil and proceed to cook our rice. But before we get there, very important to begin to cube your chicken. So begin by grabbing a bowl, of which you're of course going to be throwing all your trimmings. And very simply, we'll begin by slicing our 2 breasts in half, and very rapidly proceed to trim off any excess fat from your chicken. Proceed to also slice off any bit of that white fat that is very much attached right between your chicken breasts. And once that's done, we will proceed to cube this very quickly. So we're looking at about 1-inch chunk sizes. So proceed to begin to cube your chicken. Of course, always making sure to trim off any bits that should or may have any bones to them, and just proceed to do so right up to the very end. That should give you about 2 skewers worth of chicken. Proceed to do the same for the next piece. Trimming, of course, any excess fat that you may be able to see from the naked eye. and trim off the white bits to the sides. And once again, proceed to do the same thing as you did for your first piece. Of course, always making sure to find an evenness in your chop, and of course looking of course through your chopping, make sure to have equal sizes of your chicken. This will of course aid you in cooking your chicken more evenly, and of course eliminates any chances of you serving your chicken with a bit of some rawness to it. So once your water is boiled, proceed to add your rice. Most importantly, always give that a quick mix. And what we're going to do at this stage is move our rice over to the other side of our burner and allow that to continue cooking. Now, just to bring you back to the board, we will of course now proceed to assemble our skewers. But before we do so, we also have a few of other ingredients we need to prepare. So be sure to always turn over your board, especially when working with raw meat. This of course aids you in avoiding any contamination. And of course, always give your hands a wash. Right, so once that's done, very simple technique. We are going to begin by cleaning out our onion and pepper, which of course we'll be incorporating to the skewers. So very simply, begin by slicing off some thin slices both from the top and the bottom of your onion. And to a very simple technique to peel, just proceed to make an incision on one end of your onion, and by lifting that very lightly with the edge of your knife, you should actually be able to peel your onion very easily. Of course, always make sure to discard the skins completely. Remember, those are not particularly edible. And once done, proceed to discard. Now all you need to do is slice your onion in half, and you can reserve the other half. And very simply just slice right through the middle, and you should actually be able to pull off a few wedges from your onion. And of course, this always aids in giving your skewers a bit of color. And of course, the beautiful crispness of the onion breaks the sharpness of the spices, allowing you to get a nice beautiful balance right through. So you can just proceed to add those into your bowl with the chicken. They are going to be mixed up much more later in the process. So very simply, while holding your pepper and of course with your stem end right at the bottom, proceed to slice off from one of the sides, of course going almost around the curve. And once that's sliced off, proceed to press that onto your board, of course with the skin side at the bottom. And using your knife, proceed to work right through to the end. And of course, this will just basically aid you in removing that bit of bitter flesh from your pepper. Remember, this is not particularly very sweet, especially on a skewer, and it also carries a bit of acidity. So just slice those into two and proceed to do the same for your other piece. Now this particularly may not always be exactly the same size though, so don't be particularly worried at this stage. Of course, always just try and make sure to have almost the same size or something somewhat that can be able to cook very evenly on a skewer. And now proceed to season your chicken. So we're going to begin by adding our turmeric. Add also your coriander powder. And last but not least, your Chinese 5-spice. And all you're going to do at this stage with using a spoon, just proceed to toss those in your bowl. And this stage will basically aid you in getting just a bit of seasoning onto your chicken. And of course, the turmeric will also aid in giving it a bit of color. So I particularly like to mix my dry ingredients first into the mixture, because this will particularly help you to get a nice beautiful coating of your spices onto your chicken. And of course, once you have your bowl completely clean right at the bottom and most of your spices are very much attached to your chicken, proceed to drizzle over some olive oil and proceed to mix through. And now this will help in coating your meat and your vegetables. Remember, oil is very, very important, particularly to give a bit of color, cushion a bit of that heat. Right, so while you continue to do so, very important to keep checking on your rice. So you should actually have been able to steam that quite okay, and the liquid should actually almost completely evaporate at this stage. So I'm just going to give that just a few minutes to allow for all the liquid to completely emerge from the pot, and that should leave you with a nice beautiful mixture of rice. So to bring you back to the pot with the chicken, very important to remember to season. So small drizzle of some salt, and of course crush in some black peppercorns. Proceed to mix through once more. Of course, turning your bowl around will of course give you a nice beautiful control over your mixing, and of course keeps it nice and steady. Very important to always keep the motion very, very similar right through in order to get a nice beautiful coat all the way. And once that's done, we'll allow that to sit on the side very, very briefly while we preheat our pan on the side where we'll be cooking our chicken. So you can alternatively use any particular flat pan that you may be able to have. This will of course also cook very, very easily on your grill, so you can be able to cook that over some coal, right over some nice beautiful heat. Those will of course cook a little faster, but of course on the pan, very important to make sure that you actually cook them evenly. And of course, very importantly, you may actually of course need the help of your oven to make sure that your chicken cooks right through, because remember, we are using some nice big chunks. So at this stage, proceed to reheat your oven, of course setting your temperature at about 180 degrees. And at this stage, we can turn off our rice completely and allow that to cool off. Right now, to bring us back to the bowl, proceed to discard your spoon and begin by grabbing some of your skewers. I particularly like to just rinse them in some running water. And this will aid you two ways, particularly if you're going to be doing this on the barbecue. It will avoid the sticks from burning and of course curling up, making it impossible to hold your skewer. Second of all, by soaking your skewer a little bit, it will also avoid the skewer from cracking while it hits a pot, and of course leaving some traces of bamboo inside your meat. So very, very simple technique. I will begin the process by adding my first piece of chicken. So we'll go with about 2 pieces to begin with. Of course, very important to give it a bit of color, so begin by adding your pepper. Add 1 piece of chicken once more. Add 1 of your onion wedges and finish off by adding 1 last piece of chicken. And just proceed to do the same thing for all of your pieces, of course beginning with your chicken. And very importantly, always try and make sure to squeeze as much as you can onto your skewer. Remember, this particularly do come store-bought, so you may actually go at a loss by cooking very, very little pieces on the skewer. So one thing to always mention, or something I can share with you as a pointer, a skewer particularly looks more effective and looks more appreciated when it's actually full. But very important to mention, always leave a little of the bits of the end, particularly the flat end, which is where we particularly hold on to the most of the time. And of course, the end that is actually sharpened, you can of course fill it up almost to the end. Remember, particularly if you're holding a skewer, it is much easier to hold it from both edges. So always leave that little bit at the end. That should aid in holding your skewer a little easily. And we will just proceed to finish off just as we did with the 2 pieces, and finish off our mixture to the very end. Of course, chicken in between, bit of some onion, and proceed to add your last and final piece. So once you've got your 3 skewers or 4 skewers, we can actually squeeze in a last one with a bit of the pieces remaining. And with this one, you can actually just go mixing up everything that you have to make sure you don't actually impact any waste on your dish. And you can finish that off by topping that with a bit of onion. So once that is done, very, very simple technique, we're going to proceed to begin the cooking process. Of course, very important to keep your hands clean, especially when working with raw meat. And very importantly, if you actually have had some of your skewers touch a bit of water or actually even have a bit of the marinade, please don't be tempted to wipe this and throw it back in the same batch with the fresh sticks. You can, of course, alternatively discard these, or you can soak them in some water and you can be able to use them a little later. But of course, always very important to mention, if you have actually soaked them, do allow them to dry off before storing them. That way you will actually avoid any chances of getting mold onto your skewers. So to bring you back to the pan, very, very simply begin by drizzling some oil, making sure, of course, to give a right substantial amount that should be able to touch the surface of your skin, surface of your chicken, of course. Wiggle your pan around a few times, and you can now proceed to move your skewers onto your hot pan, of course, by using a pair of tongs. So line those onto your pan, of course having your heat at high at this stage. But very important to mention, always keep a very close eye on your skewers, especially when they're coloring at this stage. It will actually color very, very quickly. And you can now proceed to toss them very, very gently, of course, making sure to always start tossing from the first piece that you started with and continue to do so until the last piece. And this on a hot pan should actually brown anywhere between 6 to 8 minutes, allowing you for final cooking time of about 10 to 15 minutes in a hot preheated oven. Now, just as you did for the first step, proceed to turn once more as you continue cooking. Of course, you will notice the coloring will be a bit more rapid. And of course, very important to have your baking tray ready. So we're going to begin by pulling that out of the oven. And while on top of your working surface, just drizzle very, very gently with some oil. Remember, oil will particularly avoid your chicken from sticking onto the pan. It will also make it very much easier for you to slide them as they continue cooking, and of course toss them as well in your oven, allowing for a good smooth finish. Right, so we're now right about where we were looking for, and that is basically that beautiful golden brown that's coming through the top. At this stage, you should actually have your pan drying off quite a little bit, so drizzle very, very little bit of oil right over the top of your skewers and proceed to toss them as you continue. Right, simple as that. You can also season very, very lightly at this stage. Remember, you have seasoned once before. But getting that little bit of salt right over your skewers will allow for you to get any particular moisture out of your chicken very, very quickly. Of course, knowing that salt does have its ascorbic properties. All you need to do now is just basically continue to toss your chicken very, very gently on your pan. By this stage, you should actually have a nice, beautiful coloring on your peppers as well as your onions. And once you've got your color right through on each side of your chicken skewers, you can proceed to turn off your heat completely. And you can just give those a shake on the pan. Of course, doing so will actually aid you in getting that little bit of oil that's left over on your pan to clump itself onto your chicken. Some pieces at this stage will actually fall off. I don't actually waste this. Just dump them onto your baking tray. And once the first step of cooking is done, we're basically going to move those onto a baking tray. So just place them, of course, leaving a bit of space in between each piece. And that will allow for a nice, beautiful, effective cooking in your oven. Once plated onto your tray, we'll proceed to move that into the oven. And we will slide that right through the middle. Of course, using that particular point will always allow for a good even spread of heat through your oven. And now we're going to allow those to cook for anywhere between 10 to 12 minutes just to make sure they're cooked right through. But before we take that break, I am going to take you through a very, very simple preparation process for fried rice. So you'll begin the process, of course, by chopping up your onion. And of course, chopping those in the smallest size possible will probably aid you for this recipe. Be sure not to waste any of your onion. Proceed to discard the stem end and just finish off by running your knife through once more, just to make sure you have a nice even cut. And you can alternatively also fine chop these. They'll actually give a nice, beautiful color impact to your fried rice. Simple as that. Now, very importantly, begin by pouring your rice out from the pan. So using a spoon, just begin to break up your rice in the pan very, very gently. And of course, proceed to move that into a bowl. Making sure, of course, to scoop all of your mixture and avoid any particular wastes. Now, as I mentioned a little earlier, very important to always remember to not cook your rice until it's completely cooked and mushy, because you may actually not be able to get the beautiful al dente bite to it when it comes off the pan and once it's fried up with the vegetables. So be very sure to just give that a press from your fingertips, and you should actually not be able to mash the rice. It should actually be a little sticky to your palms at this stage. That is a particularly good checkpoint for your rice. Now we are going to take a short break now and assemble everything together. But when we do come back, I will of course allow you to see the beautiful finishing of this simple rice. And of course, I will also show you what the skewers look like once they're fully cooked. But before we get there, do take this chance to freshen up, and we'll catch you after a short break. Welcome back, viewers. For those of you who missed out on the beginning of the show, you can always recap for this and much more from our YouTube page. That's BrandPlus TV Kenya. But do also remember, for any comments, queries, or any particular comments that you may be able to raise that may aid us in making the show a little better, we're always more than happy to hear from you. And you can be able to do that, or even share your photos of some of the dishes that you've tried out on your own through our Facebook page. That's BrandPlus TV Kenya as well. Now we're going to start off this last and final part of this dish. Very, very simple. We're going to be making a very simple veg fried rice. So I'll begin the process by heating up some oil on a pan. Once that's in, we'll proceed to add in our onions and just give them just enough time to sweat. Next up, we'll also be incorporating some spring onions. So very, very simply, always begin by slicing it lengthways right through the middle. And the reason for this is once you open your onion, you should actually, at most cases, be able to find traces of some soil on the sides. But of course, if you have been able to find some good cleaned pieces, you should actually be able to flap those open, and there should actually be no traces of sand whatsoever. Right, so very simply proceed to chop that very coarsely. And we'll proceed to add that to our pan with the onions. And now this particular technique of using two variety onions is very much catching up with the trend, and it is actually a much healthier and more productive way of consuming your onions, because you do actually get two beautiful flavors. Of course, the sharpness of the red onion combined with the butteriness of the spring onion always brings a nice beautiful mellow flavor to the dish. And of course, now our chicken is also done. We'll just allow it a few seconds to rest. And next up, begin to add your lemongrass. So very, very simple technique I like to use. Begin by pounding it flat over your chopping board using a sharp knife, and of course using the blunt end. And you can of course proceed to remove the tail. And just by throwing in those beautiful sprigs of lemongrass into your pan at this stage will aid very, very much in adding a bit of that lemongrass aftertaste to the dish. Next up, proceed to add your mixed vegetables. And as I said, nowadays you can be able to also find mixed vegetables that are of course frozen at your retail stores. You should actually be able to trace those at your frozen food section. But of course, if you do have the time, it's always more handy to just do the mixture at home by yourself. I like to do it myself at home when I'm particularly not pressed for time. And it's a very simple process. Begin by chopping up your vegetables and of course mix them in 1-to-1 ratio, of course, to make sure that you do get that beautiful color coming through. And of course, always blanch them at very high with some boiling water, of course, and rapidly cool them with some ice water. And those should be actually able to last in your refrigerator or your freezer for anywhere between a month or even 2 to 3 weeks ahead of time. And it will also save you the process of boiling and mixing your vegetables every time you'd like to have that beautiful fried rice. All right, now we should actually be able to get that lemongrass coming through very, very nicely at this stage. And what I'll do now is proceed to remove our springs, because it will actually be very hard or not very comforting to have this picking out of your dish. So this we basically add just to infuse a bit of flavor. Of course, there's many other techniques. You can also add that to your stock while boiling some vegetable stock. It will also give a nice beautiful infusion of flavor. Right, once your veggies are almost fried up and colored, proceed to add your rice. And I'm using about half a cup of rice for this recipe. Of course, it will swell up and puff up into about 1 whole cup of rice when it's completely finished, giving you a nice beautiful portion for one, or even maybe for 2 very, very small kids, and it should actually give you a nice beautiful balance nutrition-wise. So while tossing your pan, Proceed to lift off the heat very, very briefly, just allowing for your pan to cool off. And you can season with some salt. I like to crush in some black peppercorns in my rice. It does give it a nice little bite. And you can also drizzle just a little bit of olive oil as well before finishing off. It always gives it a nice, beautiful burst of color and flavor. And of course, now at this stage, turn your heat off completely and proceed to do the same thing right up until your pan is almost nicely cleaned out at the base. And you should actually get a nice, beautiful, glistening look from your pan at this stage. Right, now next up, we are going to proceed to plate. So I'm just going to grab a plate on the side. And we'll just set that right at the front. And now begin by removing your chicken from the oven. Of course, always use something to aid you in making sure not to burn yourself. You can rest that right over the top of your gas burner. It's actually a very, very good technique to always make sure, of course, not to ruin the countertops, especially if you do have some melanin that will actually burn very, very quickly. Now, very simply, we'll begin to dish up our meal. And I will start this by plating just a nice, beautiful bed of rice through the center of the plate. And the fragrance does come out very, very nicely at this stage. The freshness of the vegetables, the beautiful crispness of the onions, sharpness of the lemongrass. You can actually be able to get that aroma coming through very nicely at this stage. Right, once you've got about one full serving onto your plate, you can now proceed to move your skewers onto your plate. Of course, giving them a turn before moving them onto your plate always aids in finding the nicest, most beautiful side to present. So I'm going to just proceed to place about 2 pieces onto our plate. Simple as that. You can also at this stage just chop up just a little bit of your lemongrass. I like to add just the dry bits of stem at the end, so just crumble those up very, very finely with a sharp knife. And this will particularly impact a beautiful flavor once you bite into it while consuming the dish, of course. And you can just sprinkle those right over the top. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the last and final part of the show. I do hope you've had some fun with us today, and you are going to be, of course, trying this out on your own at home. Remember, if you do try out some of the recipes and some of them may work or may not work, do feel free to write back to us. We're always more than happy to give our helping hand. But for now, I will bid you farewell, wishing you a beautiful evening. And until the next episode, do have a lovely, lovely evening, and see you soon.